And on that note, well, you have to ask him questions over lunch. But, so our next speaker is Dan Blackburn, who's a neurologist and senior lecturer in Sheffield. And his interest is in the early detection of dementia using conversational analysis and EEG. And he's going to speak to us today about an automated assessment of cognition based on language. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really, I'm delighted to be here. I've been coming to the BMPA for years, and the quality of speakers is always really high, so I'm trepidatious and nervous. But I thought, this is Sheffield. We have a bit of brutalist architecture. This is sort of a grey day of the Park Hill Flats overlooking Sheffield train station, and this is them being done up more recently on a more typical Yorkshire day of the blue sky. And this, you can see this in Richard Hawley's musical around the sort of history of those Park Hill Flats when the migration of people in there in the 1960s, and then how they fell into decay in the 80s and 90s, and then how they're now back into sort of a building that people love in Sheffield. So people have spoken about dementia already today. It's a huge problem, and it's a really good topic for the BMPA because, like autoimmune encephalopathy, it's treated by neurologists and psychiatrists, but we come at different angles and with different sets of tools. So it's going up, and we spoke a bit about this dementia gap. So up to a third of people never receive a diagnosis of dementia who you would have thought would have had the disease. And so as a clinician, as a neurologist who does a memory clinic, GPs don't have the time or have the tools to make an accurate stratification. It's very difficult for them. Service is really stretched. There aren't enough clinicians, nurses, doctors, neurologists, psychiatrists. There's an underrepresentation of minority groups coming to clinics. And there's national inconsistencies, as Jeremy would know of the audits that he's done. So during COVID, a lot of the services closed down, and when they reopened, they tried to use remote technology, and following on that, people are still using telephone calls and video calls. So like up to a third of assessments have some sort of virtual element to them rather than seeing people face to face. And this rise in people being seen in memory clinic has been happening for 10 years or more. So this is when David Cameron was Prime Minister, noted this stark reality that dementia is grossly underdiagnosed. And at that stage, they incentivized GPs to refer more people to us. That, not only were the secondary care memory clinics not diagnosing enough people, but also we weren't seeing people at an earlier stage. We're only seeing people at that late stage. So there's this huge increase in people coming across. And as most people know who work in the NHS, that didn't come with any increased costs to the memory services. So that post-diagnostic support, that was a struggle to keep that up. And there's more and more funds spent in sort of that diagnostic assessment. So this is what GPs do, short questionnaires, and they take a history. And there are problems with these short questionnaires in terms of people who may be excessively worried or anxious about their memory may fail them and be referred on to us, and people who are high functioning may be in the MCI or the early stage of Alzheimer's disease and still pass this stage and present to the GP and not be referred on in a timely manner. And so this is sort of the breakdown of people being seen in memory clinics. So the numbers of people with marker impairment is increasing. It's a quarter of people in the under 65 age group. But there are these large numbers that Professor Corsi mentioned, like 11% don't have dementia in the over 65, and 47% of people in the young population don't have any evidence of neurodegeneration. And if we could screen out of these people earlier, it could take a lot of pressure off the memory services. This is just data from the audit showing each line is a memory service. Blue is how many of them are diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia, and orange is how many are diagnosed with MCI. And you see some clinics, like on the right, 100% of the people who came to that clinic had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and the percentage of people diagnosed with MCI varies enormously. So it's not just the patient population, it's how clinicians formulate MCI as a diagnosis. People in this room have sort of looked at this functional cognitive disorder, which we think is an important concept about some of those people who notice their memory lets them down, which happens to all of us, but their response to it is that it's a terrible thing that's happening to them. They can ruminate on it, and they notice their memory lets them down more and more. So what sort of technology can be used to stratify people? And there's lots of technology in this space. So we've spoken a bit about online neuropsychology testing, which is useful, and there's different groups in the UK working on that. EEG is a really interesting thing. So we did some work showing differences in both the sort of time domain synchronization of the brain, in both linear and non-linear, and the difference between frequency interaction. So the ability between different frequencies of the brain to interact with each other it happens less often in people with Alzheimer's disease. Sleep is a bidirectional, as is hearing. It's an important thing to measure for those things. Sleep increases your risk of dementia or lack of sleep. Spatial awareness using virtual augmented reality, eye tracking. All these have got some use, and I think hopefully they can be expanded and help clinicians. But language is a really key task that we all do, and it has some cognitive demand. And we know that the work on Iris Murdoch, the English author, as people analysed her later novels, you could see a less of detailed and complexity in a language that predated her diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And Ronald Reagan, when they analysed answers to questions posed by reporters in 1984, but before he went to his second term, showed a change in how he answered them, loss of complexity and detail that sort of preceded his diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease by 10 years and his death by 20 years. So this is a younger, fitter presidential thing, and this is how he answered the question that he posed himself.
You know what uranium is, right? It's a thing called nuclear weapons and other things, like lots of things are done with uranium, including some bad things.
So it's both horrifying and funny, and he uses these high-frequency words, bad, sad. He posed a crazy question. He asked a question about uranium. Why would he ask himself that? It's probably not a fair question to ask himself. But I think it raises the point that we need to ask the right sort of questions in memory clinic to get the right sort of answers. So we did some work in between 2012 and 2015 with Marcus Roiber, who many of you will know, and sort of audio and video recorded people in our clinic. And do you live together?
Yeah.
Who looks after the money in the house?
Christine does.
Has she always done that, or has that changed?
Huh?
Has she always looked after the money, or has that changed? So this is a man with Alzheimer's disease. He's no longer managing the finances, and when you ask him when did that happen, because he has an episodic memory disorder, he can't answer that question. And when you ask him to give me examples of how his memory lets him down. And can you give me examples of how your memory has let you down?
I find it very easy to forget things these days.
Okay.
Especially when it matters.
Can you give me an example of the last time your memory let you down?
Not exactly, no, but it does count quite a lot.
Okay. So it's quite an awkward question, isn't it? When did your last memory let you down? These people can't answer it. It's like, it's all the time, it's every day, it happens all the time. They can't give specific answers to it. Can you give me an example of the last time your memory let you down?
I was on the telephone making an appointment for someone at work, and we'd send appointment cards out to him. And I picked the appointment card up, and I said to the customer, right, I will send you and I couldn't think of the word appointment card.
Okay. This person gives a clearly memorable example to her, and she describes a memory blocking, and she's got a functional disorder. Okay. Yeah, so she struggles to, or she can answer this. She gives a clear example of it. She says she has word blocking, and I see lots of people saying, "Oh, I couldn't get the right word out." But in the hour-long consultation with me, they never demonstrate a problem of producing that word. So it's a really common thing. So we had these audio and video files and gave them to linguists who weren't neurologists, and they were able to distinguish people with functional cognitive disorder versus those with dementia. And then we got an extra 10 patients and trained a new linguist, and they were pretty accurate too at distinguishing them. But obviously this is not a scalable approach. So the first thing we did, we gave those transcripts to a computer engineer and analyzed the data from that case series of 30. And the biggest distinguishing feature between patients with functional cognitive disorder and people with dementia was how neurologists spoke. So this is the case, isn't it, that we are diagnosing people quite early in that consultation of these sort of questions, and we adapt how we ask questions to people so our language becomes more simple to people who've got dementia as we're diagnosing it. So, there's quite an interesting idea, isn't it, of how we change our process. But clearly, we wanted something scalable, so we looked to try and create this system called Cognospeak, which is a web-based platform whereby you can speak to a virtual assistant who asks you similar questions to what we ask in the memory clinic. So we did a lot of work speaking to psychiatrists and GPs and memory clinic nurses. So in the room here, we've got a memory clinic nurse, people with MCI, their care partners, people with dementia. Heidi Christensen's the professor of computer science. She's there with us. We asked people, what's the problem with the current system? What would a new system look like? And we did lots of interactions to try and design as good a system as we could. Long or tall? There we go. So this is what the system looked like originally, and play briefly. It's quite loud, I think.
Hello, I am the avatar consultant, and I'll be asking you questions today.
Yeah.
This avatar is designed to reproduce what happens in the memory clinic. Thank you for agreeing to take part. I will start to ask you questions shortly.
And despite the grating voice and funny face, the lack of lip-syncing ability there, people still found this a relatively easy thing to speak to. So, they could respond to it pretty easy. And the interaction with the PPR work we did with people said they want to have a human voice and they wanted something that looked human. That was important to them. So that's how we had this process. And this is the new system now. You have a choice of 4 different assistants you can choose from. They all have the same text that they speak to. And this is just a sort of example of what they sound like.
Hi, my name is Nadia. Welcome to Cognospeak. Cognospeak is a digital tool used to assess people with memory problems. We will ask you some open-ended questions and record your responses. This is what we call the assessment, but there are no right or wrong answers. The questions are very general. Today we're going to go through 4 steps. We'll start by checking your device is working properly. To do that, we'll check we can hear you and that you are connected to the internet. If you've agreed to video recording, we'll check that's working too. After that, we'll do some practice questions. The actual assessment will follow. We'll finish off with some feedback questions so we can learn about your experience. Your responses will be sent to the research team. After each section, tap the stop recording button in the bottom right corner to submit what you've said. Then, in the same place, tap the next button to move to the next part.
So it's obviously an easier, nicer virtual assistant to speak to. I had a healthy volunteer complain to me about the new system, saying they felt that this new virtual system was patronizing, which I thought like the original system was not human enough to be able to patronize anybody. So the fact that they've embodied this with some sort of human attributes was interesting to me. But it takes you through the test your system. A few test questions at the beginning tell you about yourself. If you don't speak long enough, it prompts you to speak a bit longer, because obviously we want longer speech recordings. So this was from the original system we used. We had like 15 functional control disorders, 15 healthy controls, 15 MCI and AD. And just distinguishing those who think we've got MCI and AD, sort of the accuracy is 86.7%. It's good at detecting Alzheimer's disease, which is not surprising, really. It's less good at predicting MCI in this sort of small cohort that we had. So we're aware that, and we spoke earlier about AI bias. It's really important, isn't it, that's embedded in systems. Lots of the pen and paper tests were tested on white people in different parts of the world. So there's a real problem making sure we don't make the same mistakes going forward. And we know that there's an underrepresentation of people from different ethnicities coming to memory clinics, and the increase in dementia diagnosis is going to increase more so in different ethnic minority groups. And there's barriers. There's our barriers and the tools that we use, that where we have our clinics, people accessing GPs, be referred on to see us. And there are barriers from community groups of a perception that becoming more repetitive and forgetful is a normal part of aging, and that storytelling tradition of telling you stories about your past is more widely or accepted and thought of as a good, nice thing to do, that they're telling stories from their past. The word for dementia doesn't exist in many languages, and people use the word for sort of mental health or madness rather than dementia. So there's a greater stigma associated to it. So there's lots of work that needs to be done around this. So we, in 2020, worked with a local Somali community group called ISRAC, and when we applied for our I4I grant, Ismail was a co-applicant, and we trained Sarah and Musa, who are the research champions, to work on the Cognospeak project. So they ran workshops. We did workshops on brain health, on heart health, on diabetes health, speaking about what dementia is, speaking about the current pathways, discussing CognoSpeak, and then we train them, Sarah to do the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the Multicultural Examination, and the Roland Universal Dementia Assessment Scale. Just some photos, and Lisa on the left is our PPI lead in the project. So I think fluency is an interesting, it's a big part of cognitive assessment, so it represents 14% for the Addenbrooke's, which is naming as many words beginning with P, and as many animals as you can within 1 minute. In the mocker, it's only F words, and it only represents like 3% and a bit of the thing. On the multicultural examination, it's an even bigger component, it's 36%, and you name supermarket fluency, name as many items as you can from the supermarket, and you can get a maximum of 28 points, and within the RUDAS, naming as many animals, but you don't score any more once you get beyond 8. And so this is just some preliminary data from our Somali population, which is we've got people aged 18 to 85, and I think this is 49 people. About 40% of them score below cutoffs on the mocker, much smaller percentage score low on the MC and the RUDAS. And we're recruiting healthy volunteers to try and get a sort of normative data set and to check that it's acceptable and usable. When we look at the age groups, you can see the older you are, the more likely you are to score poorly on the mocker. We're trying to collect some basic information on their language skills. So how does their language skills, have they got basic, good, or fluent? Doesn't seem to make that big a difference to the mocker, your language skills, but the basic skills on the MC seem to have an effect there. But again, it's small numbers. And then if you look at animal fluency from the Somali population, as they get older, that number comes down. And P fluency was a terrible choice to use for the Somali population because they don't have a phoneme P. So lots of people say, oh, there's no words beginning with P, even though they're answering the questions in English. They say words beginning with B because B and P are the same thing for them. Interestingly, supermarket fluency is much less affected. And I think this population probably spent less time watching Steve Backshall and the Deadly 60 in their childhood and watching Planet Earth or Blue Planet and learning lots of names of animals. And I think when they do speak about animals, there's probably a greater chance of them using their own language to name those animals. Whilst when you give them a task when they're walking around a supermarket naming things that they buy themselves, that's probably less likely to be affected by using their own language because it's named and they're buying it there. So this is by English fluency, and again, similar effects, sort of your lower your fluency in English language, obviously you're going to score less well at fluency, but again, it's less affected by supermarket fluency than it is for animal fluency. And F words in the mocker seem to be less affected for whatever reason. And they named fewer animals than the white British population that we have, and they named fewer P words in the white British sort of cohort than we have. So it's really important that we get the appropriate questions asked to the appropriate population, ensuring that phonetic fluency is appropriate for them. And when we're doing the analysis with the computerized, we can look at age of acquisition, we can look at semantic clustering and switching between sort of farmyard animals to zoo animals, how quickly you switch between them, some of the concreteness of answers. But again, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate data collection to make sure we don't have any bias or reduce the risk of bias. So this is our recruitment. So we've got over 900 people who have spoken to the system so far. It's mainly healthy volunteers. We've joined dementia research, has been really useful for us. You can see the ethnic minority breakup. So the work with ISRAC has been really useful, having 49 Black African, because we hadn't had the ISRAC population. When you recruit people to studies, it's lots of white and lots of well-educated people take part in research. So it's quite hard to find those populations. And I think education is really important, find those people with lower educational groups to speak to the system as well. But we're getting there. We've got quite a large number of unknowns there as well. This is the breakdown of where we've got people across the UK. We're interested in accents, so the English automatic speech recognition system is better at detecting Southern English accents than Northern English accents. And so we know where people live. We have postcodes, we have deprivation, but we're thinking maybe we should ask people it's another question we're asking more, where were you brought up to the age of 16? Because that's more likely determinant of their accents rather than where they live right now. And this is in green is healthy volunteers, and in red is MCI just across the north. People quite like the system, so this is just the feedback at the end. Do you like the system? Yes. Are you neutral or you dislike it? And dislike is in pink. So It's a small percentage of people who dislike the system, so it is scalable, it's feasible to use this, which is good. And most people are assessing this alone, but clearly this is biased by lots of healthy volunteers, so we need to look at the data for our MCI and Alzheimer population. Again, these are the 4 people. Who do people like to speak to? They want to speak to Sarah. You know, Sarah's by far and away the most popular person they speak to, and Mariam is the second most popular. And again, the Black African, a few more want to speak Mariam, and I don't know whether that Muslim women who cover their hair, they spoke to us, they said they do want to speak to a woman who covers their hair, so we thought that was important to think. But actually, I don't think it's the most important thing to them. They'd just rather speak to somebody with a friendly voice. And we can see in ISRAC, a third of them are doing Cognospeak in the ISRAC community centre. So like having a community centre where people come in regularly is a really good place to recruit people, and it's a good people to see people to take part in studies. We're collecting mood data, so everyone does the PHQ-9 and GAD-7. I think what Professor Kurtzy was saying, that lots of people who don't have dementia may well have anxiety and depression problems, and we can see our PHQ-9 and GAD-7 scores are high in those people who've got functional cognitive disorder. And if we could, and we have got some data that we can predict their mood scores from how they answer the questions. Again, if we could take that away, it would shorten the assessment, and you could get an assessment of mood as well from the way they answer questions. At the end of, they finish Cognospeak, which takes about 25 to 30 minutes. They're invited to do an online neuropsychology. So this is working with Adam Hampshire and one of his association. So we can see that the MCI are scoring lower, as you would expect, on these certain tasks. So we're sort of bringing this data across. This is just, again, a small bit of data. We've looked at just 126. I don't have the cognitive scores on them. But again, it detected all the people with dementia. It was 87% accurate detecting MCI, and it detected healthy volunteers at 96%. So we think it's got some interesting data to sort of work on. So I think this is the idea in the future. We're trying to work together with our commercialization team so that ideally, rather than the GP looking for a pen and paper test and trying to work out what's going on, they're referred to use the system. I think it's important to note that you can do it on any computer using Google Chrome. We're supporting it on iPad, but not tablets and not phones at the moment, not Androids, just because of the cost of managing all the different softwares. But clearly, we need to have this on a phone for it to be really scalable. But hopefully that we can take away some of the time of clinician time doing these cognitive assessments, and that it's a pleasant and easy thing to do. So big funding. We have to put this in for the Eye for Eye grant, though. They're very keen for us to put some cost savings to it. So we looked at how much less time GP time would be spent if they weren't seeing anybody. If we could take 40% of people out of our clinic, that's a big saving if we can see people clean. So it's a big group. There is psychiatry and neurologists involved. We've got Adi Baji for an EDI. We've got Therapy Box, the company works with us in London. So, and we haven't mentioned the research assistants. So Dora and Caitlin are working with me doing problem solving, all the sort of, when it crashes, responding to people's queries are important. We've had 3 computer science RAs working on the project. So it's ongoing. We're hoping to get more funding, and we're interested in testing other disorders that increase your risk of dementia and cognitive impairment. So we've got about 100 recordings of people with stroke survivors, and we're recruiting from people with Parkinson's disease and people with motor neuron disease, which is going to be a tricky thing because of the dysarthric speech. But clearly, those patients who present with Parkinson's disease in clinic and motor neuron disease, they often don't get cognitive assessment, so they're often only referred to a memory clinic, if at all, once they have a dementia, rather than at an earlier stage. And I think for all these cases, if we could diagnose cognitive impairment earlier, more easily, it's going to make a big difference to our patients. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah, thank you very much.
Lovely talk, thank you very much. So I don't know where the mics are. There we go, lovely, thank you.
Thanks for a great talk. I just was struck by your point about how, as clinicians, we adapt our questioning style according to where we think the diagnosis and the interview is going. Could that be designed into a future version of Cognospeak, do you think, and would that be worth doing?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that we've got an incredibly simple system, haven't we? In some ways, it's just asking a set of questions, so everyone gets asked the same question. It's nice. I think for it to be more feasible, you'd want it to have some intelligence to respond and to detect some of those features in real time, and you can make that happen more quickly, yeah. So, and AI is improving so much more quickly, isn't it, this natural language processing, that these things are more feasible in the future.
And maybe you could make it culturally sensitive as well in sort of way in the future.
Absolutely, yeah, really interesting point. Yeah, thank you.
It's a lovely talk, Dan, thanks. But just to follow on from Paul's point, I was wondering to what extent the way humans adapt on speaking to something that's obviously an avatar makes a difference. I'm very aware when I phone a call centre and I get through to AI, I get slower and more simplistic in my language until I finally break down in swearing rage. But if you're looking at that use of slowness and emptiness of speech is the way I naturally respond to something that's avatar based, and I just wondered if that was a problem, or does that sort of come out in the wash?
Yeah, the honest answer, I don't know the answer to it. It's a really good question. We have these practice questions: tell me about yourself, tell me what your favourite food is, relatively simple things. I think if they don't speak for those 5 seconds, it's prompted you to do it again. I can imagine those who get frustrated, if there's any problems at that early stage, can answer it slowly. And I know we ask people what's been in the news recently, and some people just say, like Gaza, Ukraine, Sunak, single word answers to that. And I'm interested about how people, that's a normal way some people speak to it and to a computer, whilst other people speak at length, that there is the war in Ukraine, it's been going on for 2 years, Putin just been re-elected, and give a lot more detail to that. So we're trying to explore that ability to respond. I think if we make it as easy as possible to speak to, and as human, so this is interaction, isn't it? So this isn't a memory test. We're not testing your memory for the most part of it. We're just asking you a series of conversational questions that you can answer at length, hopefully. We know with the functional cognitive disorder patients, they quite like it, so they would speak much longer, and the clinician never interrupts them and never stops them, which is a real positive, isn't it? That they feel like, someone's interested in me and I'm listening to them, and there is an imbued humanity to this system too, that people feel like, although a human will not look at all the results of this sort of thing, it still felt, oh yeah, I'm going to tell you all this information. So I think we want to keep that interaction as strong as possible to make it to work.
Thanks, Dan. It just struck me as a bit of a shame of the way we're trying to save costs is by avoiding people with functional cognitive symptoms being seen by clinicians, because I think they do benefit from that. And could you look instead at ways of saving costs of unnecessary investigations, perhaps?
That's a very good question, Biba. And I tried to tell everybody that we're not trying to stop them seeing humans, not stopping them seeing nurses or doctors, but we're trying to stop nurses, doctors spending time doing cognitive assessments. So you've got time to speak to them and give them an explanation for their symptoms. Because actually, what I think happens, there's much less post-diagnostic support. There's much less happening. So, and I agree, I've wondered about the primary care idea that if you could diagnose someone with a functional cognitive disorder and reassure them early, then that's going to make a difference. So like if they could speak to Cognitive Speak in 2 weeks rather than waiting 18 months, the early reassurance is going to be more effective, I think. But it needs to be followed up with a human, whether that is a cognitive neurologist, a psychiatrist, an occupational therapist. I don't think we know that pathway. And I know the data from Smith Care was when they followed up their functional patients of FMD, they called it, of about 48, and they gave them a psychotherapy approach. 7 got better. 1 was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease with a 2-year follow-up, and the rest were exactly the same. So again, we feel we may do better, and I give people a description of these problems ahead, and I have no idea whether they find that beneficial or not.
Thank you. I mean, GPs are clinicians too, and they do, people with functional cognitive disorder do see them. I'm interested in the sort of the computational aspect of what's going on inside the black box of this. So to what extent is the algorithm based on, the predictive algorithm based on the patient doing what is actually a cognitive test with the avatar, so a verbal fluency test? And what element of it is based on a linguistic analysis of the conversation itself? And if it sounds like the former, you've done quite a bit of work to look to get normative values. But what about the latter? Because of that and it reflects things that other people, that Alan was saying, that people how certain are you that the way in which the tool analyzes language in this kind of quite sort of unusual social setting is actually valid across different communities, different cultures, that bit of it has actually been properly validated?
Yeah, there's a lot of work for us to do. I agree. There's an acoustic model, there's a linguistic model. So the linguistic model of recognizing what they're saying is the most important aspect of it. How they answer questions about their recent memory you're probing is really important. Fluency plays a big part. And we have looked, and we tried to look at individual questions to see which ones are the best predictor, because ideally you'd want this, everyone we recruit, we're asking them to follow up at 6 months and to continue speaking to it, because we think that longitudinal assessment is going to be the most accurate, comparing themselves against themselves to see change. But could we have a shorter system, and have the really most useful questions and the ones that are least affected by a practice effect as well? So we don't want to give people the mocker every 6 months, do we? Even if you've got version 7.1 and 7.2, are these interactional questions less affected by questions? And do we have to have different questions, and we're trying to work out what different questions we could add in for the follow-up assessments?